Project MKUltra was officially launched by the CIA in early 1953 under the leadership of chemist Sidney Gottlieb, who headed the technical services staff. The program had over 150 subprojects distributed among universities, Stanford, Harvard, McGill, military institutions, prisons, and psychiatric clinics. The main goal was to study methods of influencing human memory, behavior, and personality through chemical substances, sensory deprivation, hypnosis, and combinations of stimuli. One of the most famous episodes was the experiment at the Allen Memorial Institute Clinic under the leadership of psychiatrist Dr. Donald Ewan Cameron. He conducted so-called depatterning sessions, prolonged drug-induced suppression of consciousness, electroshock procedures significantly above medical norms, and multi-day cycles of audio cues. The patients did not know they were participating in a program funded through the CIA. A part of the sub-projects involved testing LSD. Military personnel, students, prisoners, and even CIA employees received psychoactive substances without warning. The case of Agent Frank Olson, a biochemist from Fort Detrick, is well known. He was given LSD without notification, after which his condition sharply deteriorated. A few days later, he died, falling out of a hotel window in New York. The official version stated that it was a suicide, however. In the 1990s, the family achieved a renewed investigation, claiming that the circumstances of the death were covered up. MKUltra included projects on creating truth serums, interrogation methods, personality destruction techniques, as well as attempts to understand whether it is possible to form false memories in a person. Some research was conducted in prisons in Kentucky, Atlanta, and Maryland. The subjects were often told that they were participating in therapeutic programs, although the methods were experimental. In 1973, CIA Director Richard Helms ordered the destruction of most of the MKUltra archives. As a result, during the Church Committee investigation, 1975, the committee had access only to a fraction of the correspondence and financial records. Nevertheless, even these fragments made it possible to establish that the program operated for 2 decades and included methods that violated medical and legal norms. MKUltra was officially closed in the early 1970s, but to this day, there is no exact understanding of the full scale of the experiments. Most of the participants never found out that research was conducted on them, and much of the data disappeared without a trace after the archives were destroyed. Operation Midnight Climax. Operation Midnight Climax was part of MKUltra, but had a separate structure and budget. The project was managed by the Technical Services Division and started around 1954. Its task was to observe human behavior under the influence of psychoactive substances in the most natural environment possible. The CIA rented several safe houses in areas of San Francisco, for example Telegraph Hill, and New York. The premises were equipped with one-way mirrors, hidden microphones, and recording devices. To attract people, women were used, whom the agents hired as intermediaries. Unsuspecting men were invited to the apartments, where they were given drinks, sometimes laced with substances. The leader of the operation was CIA agent George Hunter White, who had previously served in the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. He kept diaries where he described in detail the observation methods and the reactions of the subjects. According to his records, many experiments were conducted without any medical personnel and without safety protocols. CIA employees observed what was happening while sitting behind the glass and keeping detailed reports on the people's behavior. Of interest were suggestibility, a tendency towards frankness, aggression levels, and vulnerability under the influence of psychoactive substances. Methods of manipulation through an intimate atmosphere and relaxation were also recorded. Some apartments were used for years, and the project regularly received funding. In fact, this was not a scientific program, but an operational platform for testing interrogation methods and behavior control. Compliance with ethical norms was absent. Participants were never told that they were under observation or that there were substances in their bodies. The project began to be wound down in the early 1960s, but its actual termination coincided with the general collapse of MKUltra. Information about Midnight Climax only became known in the mid 1970s during the Church Committee hearings. Most of the reports were destroyed in advance, so the surviving data consists of diaries, fragments of official correspondence, and budget reports. Today, Midnight Climax is considered one of the most documented operations where the CIA used civilians as unwitting subjects, combining behavioral research with methods that went beyond the bounds of the law. Project Stargate. Project Stargate was a multi year intelligence program dedicated to the study of the remote viewing phenomenon. Work began in the first half of the 1970s and was conducted under the control of the CIA, the Pentagon, and the Defense Intelligence Agency, DIA. Initial research was supervised at the Stanford Research Institute, SRI, laboratory, where physicists Harold Puthoff and Russell Targ studied the ability of subjects to describe remote objects without having access to information about them. The project's budget was relatively small, but it was steadily allocated for almost 20 years. During this time, Stargate went through several names: Scanate, Grill Flame, Center Lane, Sunstreak, Stargate, depending on the agency that was responsible for the program at that moment. One of the most cited participants was Ingo Swann, an artist who claimed to be able to describe places on Earth and beyond it. In one of the protocols, subsequently declassified, it was recorded how Swann described the rings of Jupiter even before NASA's automatic stations confirmed their presence. Another key participant was Joseph McMonigle, a military intelligence officer who is credited with over 400 remote viewing protocols. In some of them, he described Soviet facilities, submarine bases, and structures that were not available through open data at the time. According to declassified DIA reports, a certain part of the results was deemed statistically significant. However, the practical value remained controversial. The problem was that the protocols were difficult to reproduce. The same viewer could provide accurate data in one session and completely erroneous data in the next. Despite this, the program was not closed for 2 decades. One of the factors in maintaining funding was the fear that the USSR might be conducting similar research. It is known that American intelligence tracked the publications of Soviet parapsychologists and feared the possible application of such methods. The final review of the program was initiated by the CIA in 1995. The research organization AIR, American Institutes for Research, was invited for an independent assessment. The report indicated that the data did not represent operational value and was not suitable for strategic intelligence. After this, the program was closed. A portion of the Stargate materials has been declassified and is located in the public archives of the CIA, including session protocols, analyst reports, and memos. However, a significant part of the experiments was never fully documented due to the lack of standards during the program. Acoustic Kitty. Project Acoustic Kitty is one of the most unusual attempts by American intelligence to create a mobile eavesdropping system. It started in the early 1960s as part of an experimental program of the CIA's Technical Services Division. The task was to use animals, in this case, cats, as inconspicuous carriers of eavesdropping equipment. According to declassified data, the operation included the surgical implantation of a microphone into the animal's ear canal, a miniature transmitter into its body, and an antenna disguised as elements of fur or tail. The developers expected that the cat would be able to approach the target object, for example, the windows of a diplomatic mission, and transmit the conversations of the employees. The work was carried out jointly with veterinary surgeons and CIA engineering units. The project was worked on by specialists who had previously participated in experiments on covert audio recording and the installation of devices in everyday objects. Cats were trained to move along the desired trajectory, using food stimuli and sequential routes. However, the tests quickly revealed a multitude of unsolvable problems. Cats are difficult to train, easily distracted, and react to noises, food, and traffic. It is impossible to force them to follow a specific route, especially in an urban environment. Furthermore, the implanted devices required power and were quite visible on medical scans. According to one of the declassified reports, the first practical attempt to use acoustic kitty in the field failed within a few minutes. The animal did not approach the observation object, deviated from the route, and demonstrated complete unpredictability. After a series of unsuccessful tests, the project was closed as impractical. Financial reports presented later to Congress show that several $1 million were spent on the program. This included surgical operations, equipment, maintenance of laboratories, and the work of specialists. Acoustic kitty was officially deemed ineffective, and the CIA ceased large-scale attempts to use animals as eavesdropping platforms. A portion of the program's materials was published through Freedom of Information Act (FOIA) requests, which made it possible to reconstruct its structure. Operation Northwoods. In early 1962, an official document appeared in Washington, which would later end up in the same archives as the declassified CIA materials. Its preparation was handled by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, but the discussion also involved CIA analysts assessing the political consequences of a possible escalation around Cuba. The document received a neutral, almost bookkeeping title: Justification for U.S. Military Intervention in Cuba. However, its content did not correspond to a routine report in any way. The text proposed creating a series of controlled incidents that were supposed to look like the actions of Cuban forces. The phrasing was dry, as if it were about standard military exercises. One of the scenarios described replacing a civilian airplane with a remotely controlled drone, followed by a shoot-down. In another, the damaging of an American vessel in the Straits of Florida with prepared in advance evidence of an enemy attack. The document contained working schemes of routes, timeframes, the anticipated media reaction, and internal notes about consultations with CIA analysts. From the surviving correspondence, it is clear that the document was intended for the Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, and then for a report to President John Kennedy. But the proposals were not approved. The Kennedy administration refused to consider Northwoods as a tool of foreign policy. A few months later, General Lyman Lemnitzer, who signed the document, left the post of chairman of the JCS and was transferred to the European Command of NATO. After the rejection, the initiative disappeared into departmental archives. The existence of Northwoods only became known in 1997, when the document was declassified along with an array of CIA and Department of Defense materials on early Cuban operations. A full scan of the memorandum was preserved: signatures, approval marks, CIA analytical comments, and the scheme of possible actions. Everything remained unedited. Today, Northwoods is of interest not because the scenarios could have been realized, but because it is one of the rare cases when such a document has been preserved in its pristine form. It shows what options were actually discussed at the highest levels of military and intelligence planning during the period of maximum tension of the Cold War. Heart attack gun. The existence of a device, which would later receive the unofficial name heart attack gun, became known in 1975 when the Senate Church Committee opened part of the materials on covert CIA operations. At one of the hearings, representatives of the CIA Technical Department brought into the hall an object that outwardly resembled a compact weapon with a modified firing mechanism. The demonstration looked mundane, but the described capabilities of the device were much more serious. According to official documents, declassified later, as part of technical experiments, the CIA developed small-caliber dart projectiles coated with toxic substances. The task was to create a method of covertly eliminating a target without external signs of violence. The dart, fired from the device, was supposed to penetrate under the skin, leaving a minimal mark. The toxin caused a sudden cessation of cardiac activity and then rapidly decomposed, complicating detection during a standard medical examination. At the hearings, CIA representatives explained that originally the development was part of a larger program to research biological substances available for operational use. Toxins of marine organisms and poisonous fish were mentioned as possible compounds, including substances similar to tetrodotoxin. Exact laboratory records are missing. A significant part of the project's materials was destroyed in the early 1970s by the order of CIA Director Richard Helms, who ordered the liquidation of a number of archives related to experimental developments. The demonstration before the senators became a rare case of public confirmation of such technologies. The device was shown not as a prototype, but as an element of a program that had already undergone testing. At the same time, agency representatives emphasized that the issue of using such means in real operations is not subject to discussion in an open format. In the declassified documents, there are also no direct indications of the use of the development outside of test stands. After the hearings, the program received no further development in open documentation. The Church Committee reports only record that the project existed, was tested, and was considered as one of the options for covert operational tools. All technical specifications, engineers' notes, and test results were apparently destroyed long before the committee began its work. Project Sunshine. In the early 1950s, the US began large-scale studies of the consequences of nuclear testing. One of the key tasks was to understand how strontium-90, a product of atmospheric explosions, accumulates in human tissues. The project was named Sunshine and was conducted with the participation of the Atomic Energy Commission, military laboratories, and analytical units, whose data subsequently ended up in CIA archives. The official goal of the program sounded neutral: to study global radioactive fallout. But declassified documents published in the late 1990s showed that researchers collected tissue samples from the deceased around the world, often without the consent of relatives. Samples from children were considered especially valuable. Correspondence from 1955 explicitly states that infant tissues provide the cleanest indicators of isotope accumulation. These formulations became one of the most discussed fragments of the declassified archive. Samples came from hospitals, morgues, and research centers in North America, Europe, and Australia. They were sent to national laboratories where spectrometric measurements were conducted. The obtained data were included in summaries on radioactive fallout, which were then transferred to analytical departments, including the CIA, which was interested in modeling the consequences of Soviet tests and the distribution of fallout by region. Project Sunshine remained completely classified for a long time. Most families whose relatives became part of the study learned about it decades later, after the publication of documents under FOIA. This prompted a separate investigation, during which it was confirmed that the program operated without transparent procedures and did not involve notifying relatives. Today, the Sunshine Archive has been only partially restored. Some reports have been destroyed, and some materials have been declassified with redactions. But even the surviving data is enough to determine the scale of the program. This is one of the rare cases when a scientific and technical project related to nuclear policy intersected with intelligent structures and involved real human remains without the consent of families. Operation Chaos. In 1967, a program emerged in the CIA, which received the name Operation Chaos. Formally, it was supposed to track possible contacts of American protest movements with foreign intelligence services. But declassified materials show that the project quickly went beyond the scope of foreign intelligence and became one of the most large-scale domestic surveillance systems created by the agency during the Cold War. The first tasks were highly specialized: analysis of letters from abroad, checking the travels of leaders of student organizations, comparing data on visits to Europe and Southeast Asia, These reports ended up in the analytical units of the CIA and were included in summaries about the possible support of anti war movements by socialist countries. But just a few months later, the project began to expand. Archives declassified in the 1990s show that information about journalists, university professors, musicians, and civil activists began to fall into chaos, whose activities had no relation to foreign agents. Internal letters of employees indicate that the database grew almost automatically. Agents and analysts were instructed to record any information about potentially radical groups, and the project turned into a system of general surveillance. By 1972, the Chaos Array included about 300,000 cards, of which several thousand contained expanded dossiers, biography, connections, participation in rallies, notes on publications, contacts abroad. These materials were regularly transferred to the White House and domestic policy departments. Legal issues were practically not discussed. The very existence of the program violated the CIA charter, prohibiting the collection of intelligence data on U.S. citizens. Chaos was officially closed in 1974, but its legacy was preserved in the form of declassified reports, demonstrating how an intelligence structure can go beyond its mandate in conditions of political tension. This is one of the most fully documented cases when the CIA conducted surveillance inside the country, despite a direct legislative ban. Operation Mockingbird. In the late 1940s, immediately after the creation of the CIA, a program designed to work with the media began to form within the agency. Later, it would be called Operation Mockingbird, although this name does not appear in official documents. The first recorded mentions are associated with the activities of Frank Wisner, the head of the Office of Special Operations, and Allen Dulles, who viewed informational influence as a strategic tool in the conditions of the Cold War. According to declassified reports, the CIA built a network of journalists, editors, and media structures that could disseminate materials beneficial to U.S. interests. In the correspondence, the designations reliable contact and cooperative source appear, applied to employees of major American publications, including correspondence for CBS, Time, and the Washington Post. The agency did not always dictate the content of articles. More often, it shaped the context, providing analytical briefings, forecasts, or exclusive information that guided the interpretations of events. A significant part of the work was conducted outside the U.S. The archives mention programs to support foreign newspapers and radio stations in Europe, Latin America, and Southeast Asia. Sometimes the CIA funded the creation of new publications, providing them with initial resources through front foundations. In other cases, the agency promoted analytical materials through cultural organizations and research centers so that they would reach the press under the guise of independent publications. Mockingbird was never a single centralized operation. It was a set of channels and arrangements distributed among several CIA units. This is exactly why, by the time of the 1975 investigations, most of the documentation was missing. Some was destroyed in advance, and some was never recorded in detail. When the Church Committee requested internal materials, the CIA confirmed that it had a network of contacts in the media, but provided only limited data. The Commission established that journalists were used as sources of information, intermediaries for the dissemination of information, and participants in psychological operations aimed at foreign audiences. However, the full scale of the program could not be established due to the lack of integrated archives. Mockingbird ceased to exist not as a result of a formal closure, but due to changes in the political environment and increased control over the activities of intelligence services. To date, this is one of the most documented examples of how intelligence structures could influence the information space while avoiding direct recording of their own role. Project Artichoke. When the CIA was forming its first methods of interrogation and behavioral influence, a direction emerged within the agency that was not publicized even among most employees. Internal documents called it Project Artichoke, a program that studied ways of influencing a person through a combination of prohibited substances as well as hypnosis and isolation. Officially, Artichoke was listed as a research initiative of the Medical and Technical Services Department, but declassified records show that its materials were regularly transferred to the units responsible for operational interrogations. Unlike the later MKUltra, Artichoke focused on practical scenarios for the use of chemicals in real operations. The archives preserve requests from foreign CIA stations where employees inquired whether it was possible to induce memory loss, shape submissive behavior, or obtain information from a person unaware of the interrogation. Project leaders responded with reports describing experiments with barbiturates, mescaline, scopolamine, and combinations of substances causing short-term disorientation. From declassified materials, it follows that studies were conducted not only on volunteers. In official folders, there are references to tests in closed institutions abroad, where subjects did not know that experiments were being conducted on them. In some cases, Artichoke collaborated with military medical structures. In others, with agents whose access allowed working in prisons, psychiatric clinics, and temporary detention centers. The agency paid special attention to the question of whether a person could be made to perform actions without realizing their true purpose. In the documents, formulations about creating a controlled subject and suppressing resistance are found. Although full technical reports have not been preserved, the correspondence shows that researchers tried to combine hypnosis and pharmacology, testing how long the suggested state lasts and how it manifests after the effects of the drugs. From the mid-1950s, Artichoke gradually merged with other CIA research projects, which would later be united under the name MKUltra. Nevertheless, the methodology and early materials of Artichoke remained a separate layer of documents reflecting the period when the agency was only forming its approaches to psychological operations. Upon declassification, many reports turned out to be incomplete. Some were destroyed, some were published with major redactions. Even in this form, they provide an idea of the scale of the program, in which ethical issues were not discussed. Only the result and the possibility of application in an operational environment were considered important. Phoenix Program. During the Vietnam War, the United States faced a task that standard Army operations could not solve, identifying the hidden infrastructure of the Viet Cong, couriers, liaisons, informants, and regional coordinators. Army units recorded military activity but could not trace who managed the underground networks. To solve this problem, the CIA and South Vietnamese Special Forces developed a program that was named Phoenix. Internal documents describe Phoenix as a system of information analysis, interceptions, interrogations, and operational actions directed against the political structure of the Viet Cong. The agency created a network of centers where information from the military, police, intelligence, and local administrations converged. These data were combined into unified lists of suspects, ranked by level of importance. Operational groups, which included CIA employees, military advisors, and South Vietnamese Special Forces, conducted operations to capture or neutralize members of the underground. Declassified reports show that the program operated in several directions simultaneously. Some units were engaged in identifying the communication and funding channels of the Viet Cong, others in interrogations of detainees. The archives preserve mentions of interrogation centers in South Vietnam, where suspects were sent to obtain tactical information. The methods used in these centers later became the subject of investigations. Some of the detainees claimed abuses and the use of unacceptable methods of pressure. Statistical reports declassified in the 1990s contained data on tens of thousands of operations conducted within the framework of Phoenix. The documents state that the program allowed for the disruption of local Viet Cong networks, but at the same time led to errors. People whose involvement in the underground was doubtful or unproven ended up in the unified lists. This became one of the key reasons for the criticism of Phoenix by human rights organizations and some politicians in the United States. Individual documents show that the CIA viewed Phoenix not as a one-time initiative, but as a model for future counterinsurgency operations. The agency analyzed the effectiveness of individual stages of the program, from data filtering methods to interaction with local security forces. These materials were later used in the creation of similar initiatives in other regions. Officially, the program was phased out in the early 1970s when the United States began withdrawing troops from Vietnam. Most of the Phoenix archives were partially declassified. Many reports are available, but with major redactions. Nevertheless, even what has survived allows us to see how the CIA and the armed forces used a comprehensive system of intelligence and operational actions to fight a non-linear adversary in the conditions of a protracted conflict. All the programs discussed share one thing in common. They actually existed and are recorded in declassified materials of the CIA and related agencies. Their goals were different, from psychological operations to scientific experiments and counterinsurgency strategies. But in each of them, a common logic can be traced. The work was conducted secretly, outside of public oversight, and often using methods that were not discussed at the state level. On this note, our fascinating video is coming to an end. Thank you for your reactions as well as positive comments under the video. Write in the comments which topics you would like to see in future videos. The most interesting ones may be analyzed in my next videos. See you in the next video.